So hi, I'm here to talk today. I'm here today to talk about putting the progressive into progressive web apps. So we'll explain what that means in just a second. So let me introduce myself. I'm Sam from Sydney. I've worked on web stuff for Google just for a couple of years, but I've been there for quite a long time working on Android, backend APIs, literally anything that we've done in Sydney, I've done it. So I come with an interesting background from not just working on web my entire life. I also was the lead on something called Santa Tracker, which was quite fun, and I'll actually be talking about that again in a little bit. So let's be clear, this talk is about browser compatibility. That's what I mean when I say progressive and progressive web apps. You've heard today a lot about this new fancy stuff we can do on the web, but the reality is that Chrome, Firefox, and Opera, and I guess Samsung browser are really blazing the trail for other browsers to follow. And so, obviously Safari and Chrome dominate mobile worldwide, but there's a lot of other options there, right? We've got Samsung browser, which is a fork of Blink, so it does have a lot of the same features. Plus we've got, Opera Mini and UC browser and other things like that. And in Korea, it's interesting to see the graphs. Samsung browser is like this in the last year, and Chrome is like this, right? And that's maybe not a bad thing, right? Because, it's coming from a kind of good level of support. But it's certainly interesting and something to think about when you're building, progressive web apps. This is definitely important, right? Google, it's been said a few times, but while Google has invested in these technologies, it's not just a Google thing, right? We want everyone to be able to build this stuff, and every browser vendor should be able to build this stuff. And you as developers should be able to support users no matter where they are with those browsers. So I'm just going to cover three major things today. So really, we're going to talk about push, install, and offline. And we're going to talk about how you can get those experiences basically everywhere and not just on browsers that support this fancy new stuff. So push is really about notifications and re-engaging your users. Install is about Mindspace and Headspace and getting that dream of being that application on a user's home screen that they will go and click on, right? And offline, which is actually a little bit less about offline, in the way we think about it normally, but also about working well in poor network conditions, which is a bit about working in Li-Fi environments. So let's step back a little bit. I want to talk about why we build progressive web apps, right? It's not quite for user engagement on its own. It's really about user re-engagement. You've attracted your users and now you want them to come back. And so, you want them to shop with you, buy your products, play your games, read your posts, whatever. Your site's providing that great content. And really your goal is that because you have this great content, you want to make it seamless and frictionless for users to come back and get more of that content. It should be they shouldn't even have to press a button to get more of it, right? If they're engaged with you. That's really the end goal here. And so, this flow of clicking 10 things to get your app on someone's home screen is what we're trying to avoid, right? No one ever clicks these buttons. So let's start with a clear definition. Progressive is an English word that means developing in stages. And I want to put that in context. So we have a bit of history here. It's a big slide, but we'll get through it. It's obviously a simplistic view, right? The web is not from A to B. But I want to talk about the practical applications of progressive, right? This URL down here that I've included is literally the first website. And it's, you can look it up if you want to, and I've put a search term there for you to find it. It's really boring. It has a couple of links and a bit of text. But the practical definition of progressive is that site written nearly 30 years ago still works on any browser today. And of course what we have, and what progressive really means is that any site built anywhere in this timeline actually works on most browsers from anywhere in this timeline. Of course, when we think about basic browsers, we think of, boring HTML and images. Not every site is just that. But I would guess that the front page of most news sites would actually work on Netscape, which is kind of in this HTML4 kind of era, right? The first version's there. And that kind of what's really what progressive actually means. I will mention two browsers on this slide. So Safari and Chrome are kind of here because I think they're very interesting. Safari really defined what a mobile browser could be. Suddenly, it's become very popular, but it certainly paved the way for what we should, strive for in mobile browsers. And Chrome gave us what we think of now as the evergreen browser updating kind of policy, where you get new features every few weeks. And I think that's interesting because without the combination of those two things, we wouldn't quite be sitting here today. These two things together have given us the ability to rapidly iterate and get these amazing new features on the web. So what I kind of wanted to get to with this slide is not every browser actually aims to support most features, right? When we think of the modern browsers in the world, we basically think that they're trying to be down the very right of the slide, trying to implement all the latest features all the time. And actually, there are browsers who have features not to be down that very right end of this picture. So, Opera Mini and actually UC Browser is a little bit like this too. They're on this. They're somewhere around here. I would argue. After HTML4 before really Ajax and those kinds of things, because they've seen that as a reasonable sacrifice to make to get users, content faster, right? It's compressed, it's whatever. They've done stuff with the images, and they actually choose not to run JavaScript in a way that's something we all think about. So, when we talk about progressive, this is kind of what we mean, right? Like your site, it's not just these amazing new APIs that you have to support or not support. It's also about supporting browsers like this, which make you think about whether even your basic JavaScript is really what you should be using. So I wanted to expand on the definition of progressive for the purpose of this talk. So in English, we often hear the many W's, who, what, why, where. And so we'll cover just a few. So what? Your goal here is to have content, and this is your content, the real reason people come to your site in every browser. You also want to grow from that content and allow users to really easily get more of it, whatever your site's content happens to be. Maybe that's cat pictures, posts, games, whatever. So how? You can use APIs incrementally. Always start with your content and then layer interactive and amazing features on top of that content. We've heard about some amazing technologies today, but this also includes, as I've been saying, layering simpler things like basic JavaScript or other HTML APIs. And why? Because your users are with different devices and browsers. They also have different expectations about the web. And the permission model of the web actually allows them to accept or deny certain features. And it's important that you embrace all your users, not just the ones on latest browsers, or the ones who will say yes to everything. So with that, I want to do a quick case study. And so here comes Santa Tracker again. It's an annual tradition built by Google. And every year we have an amazing website filled with games and other content and things like that. And most of these things are fairly self-contained. They don't really have much to do with being progressive. But on the 24th of December, you can actually go to the site and watch Santa fly around the earth as he delivers presents to good boys and girls. And so why is it interesting from a progressive point of view? Well, when he flies around the earth, we have this feature, which is, you can't see it very well, but it's in the very top right there. That basically says, he's 1,000 kilometers away from you, and maybe you should go to bed because he'll be here soon. Right? And this is a simple feature. But in the past, the way we implemented this is by asking the user for their location via the geolocation APIs. And so for just a simple feature, we had your device listen to a bunch of satellites and Wi-Fi towers and other bits and pieces just to get that one little number. Also, this image is pretty funny because this is actually not Santa Tracker as it was. This is the art that our vendors gave to us, and I have no idea how it ended up online. Because this was supposed to be our you should build this. And we went, no, we can't build this. These clouds are really cool, but they couldn't really. Anyway. So getting back to the point, this is a solution looking for a problem. Geolocation was the natural choice for this feature, but we didn't really need it to engage with our users. And so what you see is basically the result of that, right? Even in the context of loading our tracker, which is obviously about location and seeing where Santa is, we saw a low acceptance rate on these kind of messages. And so what we did this year instead is we started with a GeoIP service. So turns out this is actually pretty good, right? We didn't need to use this new fancy API to get the most out of our users, right? And so, of course, there's countries with only a handful of IP addresses. And since Santa visits everywhere on Earth, we looked at other signals to basically augment the GeoIP data if we weren't confident about that. If your language is Korean, then you're probably somewhere in Korea. Of course, this doesn't work for English, right? Which is our biggest user base. So we did eventually fall back to the geolocation APIs where we had to. So I want to make this point. Our historic experience was progressive, right? If you didn't have geolocation, if you said no, then you missed out on the feature. And that's fine, right? You didn't get a number. But what we learned is that we could offer the same feature without always having to upgrade our users to that latest API. And so we avoided the prompts and the kind of stress you put on users as part of that. And to me, this is really the spirit of a progressive app. So let's talk about progressive web apps now. So what I'm talking about today will help you make your sites more progressive. But it's not specifically about Chrome, Service Worker, or any other specific technology. Progressive web apps are really sites just built with progressive enhancements, as we've defined it before, focused primarily on bringing app-like features to users' increasingly mobile devices. And this is kind of the M&M analogy, which I was asked to include. Your content is really the most important thing, and then you layer on the enhancements. You make everything better by adding layers, but it's really clear that the most important part is the middle part of the peanut. Although some people really like chocolate, so it's an interesting analogy. When you're using these APIs, it's really important not to force them on your users. Everyone's had this experience, this full screen pop-up blocking the way to some site, right? And this is really the wrong way to go about asking your users to use some amazing new feature. For example, Google Plus actually did a study on their interstitial, which they had on the front of their page saying, please install our native app. And they found that 70% of people dropped out of that immediately, right? They never read the content, they never installed the application. Because really, they didn't care about Google Plus, right? And arguably, who does? But people were being linked there to see some little bit of content, right? They didn't care about they didn't care about what your site was offering aside from that. They wanted to read that thing. And so, even if it's well presented, even if it's nice, that fact you're going to block me from what I want is really going to frustrate me. So, and one other thing to notice, if you do something like this, Google will actually consider your site to not be mobile friendly. And we use this as a ranking signal now to actually boost your sites when users are searching on mobile. If they're on a phone and they search for your content and you're not considered mobile friendly, then you'll actually be lower ranked than maybe your competitors or some other site that is mobile friendly. And so we'll actually look for this kind of thing and lower your ranking. So it's a serious concern. So it's important to learn from the standards committees working on new APIs. The way we've built things like add to home screen actually prescribe the level of engagement that users have to have before they see the feature. And this only happens in a couple of APIs right now, but I actually believe it's going to happen for more and more as we go along. We've measured engagement, and that API just doesn't appear to you as a developer until we're confident about that. We know to some extent that some developers will make that short-term grab, which we think makes the web worse for everybody. If you're making a short-term grab for someone's email address or someone's contact or something, some feature, then we actually know from data that this isn't going to work. It's going to end badly for everybody. So, I don't think it's important that every API should be like this. As developers, you should have that choice, but it's something you should really think about. And the key here is really knowing when to upgrade your users to the latest feature, and that's as much being progressive as actually using that feature. And this is especially important if you're trying to write some backwards compatible version of this feature where you don't have access to that kind of engagement signal, which is kind of what we're talking about today. So let's start with the very first progressive experience. Something people forget is that HTML is actually an imperative defined language that actually runs top to bottom. It's just like JavaScript, C++, or Python. And you can actually leverage this to speed up your site, or create the perception of speed in your site. And so let's do a quick case study. I'm just going to talk about a new site. It's kind of a proxy for more complicated interactions. So this is maybe what it looks like in HTML. It's a pretty basic page, has a bunch of content, and there's a couple of links. It's really the core of why people come to your site. As you enhance and modernize your sites, web apps can end up looking a bit like this. And this is not an unreasonable, it's kind of a natural evolution, right? I'm going to actually load my content with JavaScript and make it really easy for people to move around. Maybe I'm going to hijack links and things like that. But they've kind of missed the point, right? Like, you're blocking the content. You're basically forcing the user to download your page and then do another HTTP request, or at least one, to actually get the content. And so, this doesn't necessarily happen in practice, but it's the thing you want to avoid. This is not progressive at all, right? That's the worst part. There's no fallback. Most users can run the JavaScript, but if they can't or the network is bad, you're adding an extra step between that user and what they want to see. So remember to focus on your content, include it in the first HTML request. And this is exactly the same as what we saw before, somewhat intentionally so. We're going to add to it as we go, which is really what being progressive is about. So we're going to add some blocks that enhance this page, right? So since this is a new site, we want to let users get that content faster. So we're going to use click interception to intercept user clicks and load new content with Ajax. And so that's the load content method here. And we've actually put the script at the bottom, so it doesn't block rendering. And actually, this async tag doesn't make sense, but let's pretend that it does. So you also want to put async on your script tags because you basically can tell the browser that you don't really care when the script runs, right? It's not part of the loading flow. It's not part of that top-to-down execution, and we don't really care when it happens. We just want it to happen at some point in the future. And if you don't have service worker, this kind of thing is ideal, right? This is kind of the natural first progressive enhancement for any site. And so finally, if you can cache this page, which is interesting, maybe you can with service worker or some other technology, we can call it we can basically redefine it to be something like an app shell. And so even if the page we have cached is actually about these socks that we first posted on, we first had up, and you can see this code checking for socks, what we can actually do is then hide that content and then immediately fetch something new. So this looks a bit like the app shell, right, that we wanted to avoid, where we were loading content with Ajax. But turns out, since this was from the user's cache, there was literally zero cost in this, right? Like this page is already here if you can cache it offline. So the first network request you do make is that request for content. So you are still achieving that goal of immediately getting users what they want, even if you do show a loading screen at this point. But that loading screen will appear immediately, as opposed to once the page is finished loading from the web in the first place. Okay, so let's now get into our three major topics. Let's talk about push. Basically, notifications, and how do you re-engage with your users after they've visited your site at least once. And so let's cover some of the stuff we talked about before, right? This is how we check for native support. Check for support, run some code, install a service worker, and then use the push manager. This is great, and it's forward-facing, but it's not available for everybody. And while it's one of the simplest ways to engage with your users, it's actually not the only way. And so sometimes other approaches, even more archaic approaches, can actually fit into the re-engagement story better than this. And so I'll use a transport analogy. When you're going from A to B, you have a number of different options. Some people have a car or a bicycle, so they have that option available to them, but some of them don't. And in the same way, when you're sending a notification, you really need to look at the best possible approach for your users. What do they want? There should be an element of planning. You should look at your users and decide what they actually need. Just the same way as when you're deciding to go somewhere. It's also important to be timely and actually have thoughts about whether things should be timely. Here as an example, I've invented a social network where I can nudge people, which is hitting people with your elbow. And so the important part of the social network is getting this message to your users as soon as possible. So in this case, it does actually make sense to trigger a push notification, as soon as possible, right? That nudge should, while it should record that for later, should also send a message to GCM, and that should, appear on your phone relatively quickly. That should be an immediate flow. But this isn't right for every update, and if your users don't have this ability, you need to decide on what you can do instead. And something to think about in this kind of space is that actually social networks do this really well, right? Like very few people are notified on every post that their friends make on social networks, right? They will typically use aggregation to group up relevant information and notify you at some later point. And actually email can be the right option there because it is the right form for kind of long form aggregated content. And so while this is great and sexy, it's not actually what you always want to use. So to help decide how you should re-engage with your users, you should ask questions. Do you have information? Their phone number, even their social contacts. And why are you engaging with them, right? Are you asking a question or just being informative? Is there a new blog post, or is there something that a user has to action right now? Is it important that a user is notified at a specified time? Is that time now? Maybe it's 9 a.m. tomorrow morning because that's a useful message they need before they go to work. Could it be at any point in the future? And so finally, are you already engaging with them, right? If you already have some knowledge about the user, you've got their phone versus their desktop, you shouldn't be potentially re-engaging on their desktop because they're getting their push messages on their phone. So there's no value in that, right? You can sort of somewhat profile users a little bit to say, well, I know more about you than just a single session might otherwise indicate. So let's talk quickly through the pros and cons of all these options. So, you've heard about push messages before in the previous talk. They're short, timely notifications that should be engaging, and ideally they should be actionable. What can I do with this message? These notifications will only go to a single device, and they're low effort for a user to interact with. They're also really easy to dismiss. So if you have something really important and you're not sure about the time you're sending it to them, you might find that a user, by the time if you send it at 3 a.m. and they wake up at 9 a.m. and they have 10 messages, maybe yours will get lost in that noise. And also look for, and I'll restate actions, right? So make sure these things are actionable. If you don't provide clear options for users, what you might find is that the user might dismiss it they'll read the notification, consume its content, and then dismiss it. And you can't really tell whether a user just doesn't like it or whether they've actually consumed your content. Because users may not know how to hide it, right? They're getting this annoying message, they're just going to be frustrated at your site. So making them actionable makes it very clear that a user is enjoying it or not enjoying it. So emails can be longer form, as I mentioned. They can provide rich HTML with a lot of options. You can make them actionable too, right? You can add custom buttons and things like that. And one thing that's very important with these sort of kind of messages is you should make it really easy to get back to your site or your application. Because these emails might come in different contexts in which they were maybe generated in the first place. Maybe they're reading email on their computer, but it was an action on their phone. Make sure that when they click on links to that site, you make it easy for them to sign back in. The way you can do this is by potentially including their email address, within that link, so that they're prompted only for their password versus a whole new login flow, or whatever that means for your site. Some sites actually have a light mode, where the token in the end on the URL will actually allow a limited set of actions before they have to sign in properly, because you're fairly confident that the user who's clicked on that link is actually your user. And so making that seamless makes it easier for users to get back and get to your content. So SMSs are quite interesting, and actually they're used in quite a few places. So when I book a doctor's appointment, I'll actually get an SMS and an email. And the reason for that is that they're not confident that I'll have email or a working data service or anything, right? They're not sure about any part of me aside from the fact that I have a phone. And it's a pretty safe assumption to know that no matter what phone it is, it probably has SMS, and I can probably read that most of the time. They're not confident that I have access to it, but they can always be confident about my SMS, ability to use my SMS. And so, for them, that makes a lot of sense. But in SMSs, make sure you only include one link, right? Don't make it too confusing. Don't overload it with stuff. Because actually, it's a very short format. And try to keep your links short so it's easy to click on and go and do something with that. And for social, it's pretty similar, right? If you actually know someone's Twitter handle, you could use a bot or some other tool to engage with them. If your site really is about Twitter, then that's not going to be a surprise to your users. So now you've decided on a transport. How can you prompt a user to actually give you details to help you with this transport? This is the native format, right? This is pretty clear, site wants to send you notifications, allow a block. But what if you want to get someone's email address or phone number? What is the best way to do that? You should try to match the intention of this prompt, even if you're not, even if you are building it yourself and you're not using this guy. One thing you can actually do is leverage the browser to help you get data. So by using the autocomplete, I was going to say prefill, tag, users will get a prompt basically saying, do you want to enter your phone number here? Or maybe they'll type a single number and they'll get the rest of the phone number prompted for them. So by doing this kind of stuff, you can make that flow even more seamless, right? And in fact, you can imagine this class in CSS here could actually describe a pop-up dialog that's at the bottom of your page, just like what you've seen in the native experience. So push is a great kind of form of re-engagement, right? It's event-driven, it's based on your site, you want to tell your users things. Let's take the next step and actually talk about how a user can come back on their own. So rather than typing URLs or clicking on bookmarks, how can you get your site on your home screen, especially in devices where the manifest isn't supported? And that brings me to install. This is the modern way. Create a manifest and link to it. This works in a bunch of browsers. And in fact, in Korea, I think Samsung browser supports this really well. So I think 80% of the market is going to support this right now. But iOS is about 20%, and that's a serious kind of market group of the market, which is quite hard to make sure that this actually works. And this is what this actually looks like when you have it natively, right? You'll see an engaging pop-up that will appear after a user has visited your site a few times. But for compatibility, you actually need to include a lot more, right? Much of these kind of meta tags match what's in your manifest. But Safari and other browsers will look for this quite aggressively. The list is standard, include a web app capable tag if you're going full screen, more on that later, plus theme calls and seemingly an innumerable list of icons. Standard Tracker has something like 15 or 20 icons, which always felt a bit obscene to me. So different platforms have different stories, right? In 2007, Apple famously announced that you should write amazing Web 2.0 and Ajax apps, and they really brought us what we now know as add to home screen. So they pioneered that, but of course about a year later, they gave up on that approach. They haven't really given it much love since then. It was popular at the time, right? It was the only way to have third-party applications, so it was heavily promoted. So with the manifest and service worker, you can get an engagement you can get a prompt for install, and you can even hold on to that in your site if you want to, and present it at some point where you're comfortable with that, right? Maybe some more engaging button than what we're going to show your users directly. But without this feature, a kind of common theme is that there's no real way across effectively any browser to have that browser prompt your users to install your application. There's unfortunately no way to actually do it. So if you can't trigger the flow, what is the best practice? And actually, it's HTML that lives inside your site. That hints the users to do what is the right thing to install that application given their browser. This practice is fine, but as we talked about with push, keep it small. Don't block a user when they're trying to use your site. And actually, a tricky part here is that you have to make a decision about when to show this, right? Is it worth showing it immediately? Is it worth showing it after a couple of visits? It can be effective, but users can find it frustrating. There's a small number of libraries that will help solve this for you. So you literally dump a library on your page, and it will actually show the right kind of dialogue or prompt, literally with an arrow pointing to the right location for a user to click on. They're mostly focused around iOS, and they're trying to solve two problems. One is that the position and image of this icon has changed over time. What do they click on? How do they engage with that? And it's actually different on different devices. On an iPhone versus an iPad, that button is going to be in some way different. And so that library will help you, take that, remove that kind of challenge for you as a developer. This isn't such a problem on Android. Of course, if users are up to date on Android, they'll get the manifest add to home screen experience. But on Android, the add to home screen icon has pretty much always been in the upper right-hand options menu. So there's not really a challenge there. But the next part is it can actually be quite tricky to work out how a user has opened your site. If you've chosen to open your site in a standalone window or a full screen window, it's not too hard because the browser will usually tell you that. It gives you a property. We'll cover that in a second. But if your actual home screen icon only opens a browser tab, it's actually quite hard to work out whether the user has just navigated there or whether they've actually clicked on that home screen icon to come back to your site. Something to think about is that if there's no history behind that, if a user hasn't got any history pages behind their site, then actually that can be a sign that they've clicked on an icon to get there, but it can also be a sign that they've opened your site in a new tab. The point is it's quite challenging, and various people have had different approaches on how to solve this, and this is something that libraries can help you with. So, as I was saying, another question you have to decide when you use this feature is basically whether to load in a browser tab or load full screen. And so, this property can be set with a meta tag, as we saw before, or as part of your manifest file. So this example is kind of a good contrast between the options, and pretty much why you'd choose one over another. If your site is really part of the web providing content, then you really probably want to open in a browser tab. You don't want to hide the fact that you're really just a website. But if you're a utility like this air horner or some other site like a calculator, or we obviously have simple examples in our mind, but maybe you've got something more complicated, then you might want to open in full screen or standalone mode. But on iOS, there's actually a challenge here. So that app on your right there will actually be aggressively killed by iOS as soon as it's closed or made hidden or whatever. And so any state you've stored, any assets you've loaded, gone. I mean, you can kind of avoid this a little bit by using like the app shell approach and caching a lot of files offline, but it can be tricky to work out and something you should factor into your decision when you actually choose to build one or the other. On Android, this isn't quite such a problem, and you get that kind of benefit of cache and not being killed, but something you should think about. There's also some challenges on iOS for certain types of applications living inside a browser tab window. Something we found on Santa Tracker is that it's actually very hard to hide the address bar on iOS, which can be really important for full screen applications or sort of a complicated application with lots of scroll views. So in that case, we prefer to use the option on the right because even though there was quite a big loading cost, we actually benefited from the full screenness of that experience. And that's something we were willing to trade off. And it's interesting because regardless of what you choose, you actually don't have to do anything to support this right now. Every user on your site can actually go and click that Add to Home Screen button. But as I was saying before, there's no prompt, So really your users aren't doing that, right? Like there's such a low uptake rate of that on its own. So once your user has loaded your site, there's basically two other things you need to think about. One is basically, if you're in standalone, you'll have to make the decision about when to send a user outside your application window. Are you embedding external content, or do you have external content at all? And do you want to send users to their real browser? And if your app is in a browser tab, and this is a kind of a tricky concept, but that browser tab, when it starts, is kind of tethered to that home screen icon. If I click that home screen icon again, then I'll basically be brought back to that existing tab. If you change the URL, then what will happen is that clicking on your home screen icon will now load a new tab. So you can actually avoid this by using the history API to basically pretend as if you're changing URLs without actually navigating anywhere. This is just something you can think about in terms of what the life cycle of your application when it's installed should look and feel like. So once you're pushing to users and are on the home screen, the last thing you want to think about is, how can they work offline or in poor network connections? So it's kind of the theme is, while it's great to be thinking about offline, your site may never even have a chance, right? Like if users' devices don't support offline in the way you want, your site may never load. But if it's still around, the best advice I can give is don't panic, right? I talked about App Shell, and that kind of approach can help you because you can actually, in poor network environments, detect failures in things like AJAX requests and whatnot, and intercept them and give a cached object or some fake content, or show the user something sensible in this environment. You've got the shell, and you can now control that rather than giving the browser full power of your URL. You can actually use document.online to find out more about whether you're actually offline. Amusingly, it doesn't really help you to find out whether you're online. We have this problem with Li-Fi where technically you've got a network connection, but it's not doing anything for you. So this API is kind of useful, but not completely the silver bullet. And so, like I was saying before, the key here is to avoid the changing the browser's URL in a way that actually would force any kind of traditional reload. This is the analogy of being on your little island. Don't let the user get off their island, right? Because if they try to get off it, they'll fall and drown or something like that. They're going to have a bad time. And if they change the URL or maybe navigate outside your site, they may not be able to get back to your site because now it's sunk into the ocean. Maybe I need a better metaphor. But your AJAX requests are kind of that speculative foot in the water to see whether you actually can get off the island right now. Is there a boat waiting to take you somewhere? So you can really think about this as two approaches. Most sites are going to be offline capable because if I happen to cache these files, it'll load fine, right? I'll be able to load these files again at some point in the future. But it's restrictive. But if you assume the network is a feature, which is kind of the underlying thing underneath App Shell, is that you can always assume your network is offline. You can always assume you're going to have a bad time, and then you progressively enhance your site with networking capabilities. And then if it is online and it is available, then you do make those requests and you do give the user new content or whatever your site's serving. And with Service Worker, you actually have a built-in cache that does this, right? This is kind of what Service Worker does for your site. It lets you use network as a progressive enhancement. But actually, if you don't have Service Worker, you can actually do a pretty similar thing with the local storage APIs. So you can actually cache data yourself and serve something sensible for that those AJAX requests that your site might be making to bring in new content. So a few notes on lifecycle in terms of offline applications. One interesting bug or feature, I'm not really sure, on both iOS and Android, is that if you tap on a home screen icon, it'll pretty much always force that browser tab that has your user's site in it to reload. And this is obviously a really bad idea if they happen to be offline. If you want to keep your site working, it's in a browser tab, why should it die? They should be able to keep using it if they want to, keep reading your content. Maybe they had an article up they really liked. If they click that home screen icon, it will actually reload your site. And this is totally useless when you're offline. There are some solutions. I actually wrote a blog post on this. It's kind of out of scope and somewhat technical, so I don't want to go into it. But there is some light at the end of the tunnel on this front. So we've covered a lot, but I have a couple more points before we finish up. So I want to talk about perception. So I don't know if anyone's seen this this study before, but let's look at the difference between these two spinners. So the one on the left is effectively iOS's default spinner. And on the right, we have this hypothetical, let's say this is from your application. There's a source down there, but it's a little cute spinner. So Facebook released it wasn't really a user study, but they made a quick note that they found that when they showed users the icon on the left, they blamed the OS for any loading problems. If they showed their Facebook icon, which was pretend it's on the right, users blamed the application. So I'm not necessarily suggesting you should do this just to shift blame around the place so that people don't blame your application for some activity. But it really highlights the importance of making users feel like they're making progress, right? Your high-level goal here is to deliver content as soon as you can. And if you can't, let users know that their phone hasn't broken or crashed. If you can pull from a cache like Service Worker, that's great. If you can't, this highlights that user perception is really important. It's probably more than half the battle here. And so to look at some concrete examples, what are some great examples these days? Sites like Facebook and Medium are aggressively using this placeholder approach, right? They have rather than using a spinner or a loading icon, they'll actually show this kind of dummy placeholder text, which actually, works reasonably well. And so they'll also show low quality images, right? If they can't pull down whole content, or they're not sure you want to see this image, or maybe they want to pull this down really quickly, you can download a really low quality image. Maybe it can be 10 by 10 pixels. Actually, these images turn out are really high quality because they're really just images that have been blurred. But on the web, I can serve down this really low quality image. I can blur it with CSS, and then I can actually make this image visible at a later point. Because this gives the perception of loading really fast, even though you know that image is going to be really big and it will take a long time for users to get it. I can actually use an API called the Intersection Observer API to only load these images when they become visible to the user. So let me reiterate some points about speed, right? Use App Shell whenever possible, but still include the initial content. It's really what users come to your site for. Draw quickly and don't use blocking JavaScript. So my very last point, this slide is kind of a bit out of place, but I want to sort of end on it. Another quick example about when progressive APIs are really useful is, or the perception of when you want to use APIs or not, is I want to talk about the media stream APIs. So if you're building an application that uses the camera, they pulled in some content from the user, you stylized it, changed it, whatever, you might want to use the media stream APIs. It's about getting data from a camera. But there's a lot of permissions here, right? And a lot of setup flow. And actually, it's often easier just to use a file element, right? On mobile, people have realized that this is basically paramount to asking the user for a photo from the camera or a photo from their photos library. This is a clear user action. So it's worth looking at APIs and saying, well, what is my intention, right? I really need this fancy whatever API when actually something simpler can suit me. And actually, you can use the permissions API in some cases to look at this. So there's only a few permissions in this API right now, but you can actually use this object to see whether a user has granted a permission or whether using an API would prompt the user to have to grant that permission, or whether you can just go and do that action. So I'd encourage you to use this API to actually see whether users have allowed geolocation or have allowed, I actually forget the list of the APIs that are in this spec, but there's quite a few. And you can basically say, well, would I prompt the user for this feature? And if you may find that, while it's great to use the feature if it's available, the cost of prompting that for that user is actually worse than just using it directly or not using it if it's not available. Cool. And so that's it. Thanks for listening. The core takeaway from this is really, focus on your content, right? And as you're working with your new goals, like push, install, and offline, remember that there's many ways to achieve these, right? It's not always the latest and greatest APIs, and your users will not necessarily have those. And it's sometimes just a more thoughtful approach. As I was mentioning the story about media stream or user perception, right? You can often make a big amount of progress by just changing the way users think about your site, rather than actually forcing them forcing some new API, on your users. So by remembering these points, you'll create great experiences for everyone.